Hello, this is W.Berry, the Regional Emergency Coordinator for the state of Vermont. This briefing is provided to update the region of Burlington on recovery efforts associated to the devastating winter ice storm. Recent emergency response efforts have centered on damage assessment and seeking federal and emergency mutual aid assistance. And before I begin to provide those updates, I need to stress to everyone that we cannot say the worst is over. I'm receiving weather updates predicting frigid Arctic airs inbound, and temps could drop into the single digits, plus some winds on top of that, which is going to make it feel even colder. With widespread power outages potentially weeks away from repair, the safety and welfare of our citizens is at great risk, and deliberations are underway regarding mandatory evacuations, which I will touch on here in a second. But first, I want to update you all on our government response. As you're aware, the governor of Vermont declared a state of emergency, and FEMA is involved in recovery assistance. For those of you not aware, Albert Lewis has been named as the federal coordinating officer. Our efforts are being coordinated within the Vermont Emergency Operations Center. And as I mentioned at the onset, additional resources provided through mutual assistance is on the way, but will take some time to deploy, especially in rural areas. I'm happy to report that a total of 3,000 National Guardsmen are being deployed and arriving throughout the week. I'm in the process of defining those tasks and distribution of those resources and those personnel. I want to thank all of you who have been providing us damage assessments. Please keep those coming. Your reports are allowing us to accurately assess the level of resources needed and to work our response plans effectively. I am now going to highlight a few of the major concerns we are seeing and then discuss a few responses under consideration. Up front, I want to emphasize the weather outlook. To put it mildly, inbound weather is not going to cooperate with recovery efforts and is forcing us to consider mandatory evacuations. And here's why. The National Weather Service has issued an extreme weather alert for New England, and temperatures will immediately drop to lows of 10 degrees with those 15-kilometer winds I spoke about. The temperatures are especially hazardous for children and elderly, but are magnified tremendously given these widespread power outages all over Vermont. Our rural areas are certainly most at risk here. We are now establishing long-term winter shelters for storm victims and turning our efforts towards getting affected citizens out of their homes and into the shelters. Shelters are going to be a priority for a number of reasons. Firstly, we have been providing citizens with updated safety messages and weather warnings and encouraging evacuation. Unfortunately, the power situation has compromised those communications of those messages to rural areas, and in many cases, when it's received, some citizens are still refusing to evacuate and leave their homes. I'll touch on this momentarily, but most of the region will be without power for several days and/or weeks. For those choosing to remain at home, the cold wave has the potential to increase casualties and injuries. On that front, 10 people have already died from hypothermia, fire, or carbon monoxide poisoning, and 30 more are in local hospitals with ice-related injuries. This is an alarming trend that I expect to probably rise and will worsen as the temperatures drop. I'm also concerned about those rural citizens and getting them to shelter. I'm sending a legal position paper to the governor today to consider mandatory evacuations. While that decision and subsequent instructions are awaited, I'm asking you to continue efforts to encourage evacuations to one of many shelters in the region. For those refusing to leave their pets, please direct them to one of our pet-friendly shelters here in Burlington. FEMA has those location details, or I can provide those to you separately. Some residents may also fear looting upon evacuation, and I understand this is a legitimate issue, and break-in reports have increased, especially in our rural areas. Retail theft is being reported, and I've received a briefing from the police department and will be incorporating their concerns into a tasking plan for responding resources, to include the National Guard. Please be aware that the lack of coverage and assistance has elevated concerns amongst the public who have taken to demonstration in front of town halls. Again, communication remains key and becomes especially important in all facets of the emergency response. Citizens must be informed of the current weather alert, the power situation, evacuation plans, and shelter locations. In the end, the government of Vermont has an obligation to help people through this emergency, which may soon include taking decisive steps to remove them from harm's way. I hope we can avoid this, but ultimately it is our duty to provide for the community welfare, and we cannot risk making the situation worse for our citizens or our emergency responders. Let me talk a minute about our current power situation. VOCO has assessed that 575,000 people are without power. Those are unfortunate numbers. I don't have a projected timeline for service to be fully restored, but let me take a moment to read over the damage reports from Velco. Currently, we have what is destroyed: 1,000 electrical pylons, 130 large pylons for 735 kilovolt transformers, 60 medium pylons for 350 kilovolt transformers, 80 pylons for 120 kilovolt transformers, and 25,000 transmission poles. Those are the wooden beams in your neighborhood. That's devastation right there, folks. It should be noted that generators also are no longer available in stores. And I'm not confident that those that have them or have alternate heating sources are operating them correctly. Fire and Rescue has noted several cases of accidental fire in homes and flooding from pipe ruptures in public and private buildings. Carbon monoxide intoxication is another issue for those attempting to generate their own power. Some additional concerns that we're seeing. Thousands of farm animals are expected to die or to be put down due to disease or hypothermia. Again, major highways, city roads are still in bad shape. Businesses are closed, but I have received some troubling reports that those operating have limited supplies due to the high demand. Prices are then skyrocketing currently at the moment, and we must work to get those under control. As noted earlier, looting in rural areas is a huge concern, but I am hearing troubling reports of retail break-ins and stolen generators too. I anticipate those problems could worsen given reports that citizens living in power outage areas are not receiving vital information. Again, we should operate off the assumption that our citizens are not prepared for this worsening situation. We should also assume they are not hearing online, phone, and radio emergency messages. Communications to rural disaster areas may be an area of emphasis for the National Guard, which I'm working to develop. This could also coincide with mandatory evacuation enforcement, depending on the governor's order. To clarify a few points on the National Guard and their use, the use of force by its members serving in state active duty status or under Title 32 will be governed by state law, usually criminal law. The use of force will be restricted to the minimum degree consistent with mission requirements. We're not looking to appear as a militarized state here. The goal is to reinforce citizen confidence in law and order so they can willingly follow recommendations meant to ensure their long-term welfare. Secondly, I'd like to see the National Guard assist with the setup and disbursement of vital communities to the community. And there's room for them to really show some effort and support there on that regard. Now, relief is arriving, and the focus is on the prioritization of tasks centered around urgent emergent issues. We want to get service and support to those that need it most. We also want to get vital emergency information out to our hardest hit areas and our most rural areas. Prioritizing the direction of resources still requires assessment and reporting from local officials. We are receiving tons of donations and must begin to distribute them accordingly. I'm going to ask you to please continue to communicate with donors and volunteers to appropriately direct the delivery of food and commodities. Again, leverage those partnerships with private and public sector agencies here. They can still be a humongous help for us. Again, thank you for your time and attention, and keep those updates coming in. As always, please stay safe.